At the start of the 18th century, after centuries of rivalry, conflict, and then coexistence under a shared crown, England and Scotland finally agreed to formal union. Since 1603, the two kingdoms had shared one monarch, James VI of Scotland, who was also James I of England, but they remained legally separate nations with their own parliaments and laws. This division frequently led to tensions, especially as Scotland sought to balance its position between England and the powerful states of continental Europe. By 1707, political calculations, economic interests, and strategic pressure compelled both sides to reach a historic agreement, the Acts of Union. Under the terms of the Acts, England and Scotland were united into a single state, the Kingdom of Great Britain. The Scottish Parliament was dissolved, and its MPs were sent to Westminster to participate in a unified political system. Economically, Scotland, long isolated and periodically racked by crises, now gained access to England's vast trading empire, with shipping routes stretching across the Atlantic Ocean. In return, England gained a unified northern frontier, eliminating the risk of Scotland forming alliances with France, its historical adversary. A new symbol was born, the Union Jack, blending St. George's Cross of England with St. Andrew's Cross of Scotland, an emblem for a new kingdom poised to take the global stage. With this foundation, the 18th century witnessed Britain's transformation into a global empire. Trade, colonial expansion, and warfare became the three pillars of British power. During the War of the Spanish Succession, 1701 to 1714, Britain seized Gibraltar and Minorca and secured the Asiento, the lucrative right to trade slaves across the Atlantic. It was a decisive step toward dominating strategic sea lanes and expanding British naval influence worldwide. In the mid-18th century, the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, broke out. Many historians have called it the First World War, and Britain emerged as its greatest victor. After fierce battles spanning Europe, North America, and India, Britain seized Canada from France, laid the foundations for controlling the Indian subcontinent, and captured several other strategic colonies. From this point forward, Britain was no longer merely a European power, but a global empire, with the first precious jewels now set in its crown. Yet this young empire would soon face a bitter defeat. Across the Atlantic, Britain's 13 colonies in North America were growing increasingly prosperous, yet also increasingly discontented with taxation policies and their lack of representation in Parliament. This tension erupted into the American War of Independence, 1775 to 1783. Though the British initially held the advantage, in the end, with help from France and Spain, the Americans triumphed and founded the United States of America. The loss of the 13 colonies, once a source of pride, forced Britain to rethink its global strategy. Instead of looking across the Atlantic, it began to invest its power in Asia, Africa, and Australia. The failure in America became a turning point, pushing Britain to make India the jewel in the crown, to expand influence in Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa, and to gradually construct an empire so vast it inspired the immortal phrase, "The sun never sets on the British Empire." At the beginning of the 19th century, the political map of the British Isles changed once more. After centuries of conflict, rebellion, and suppression, Ireland, with its majority Catholic population, remained a constant concern for London. With the spread of the French Revolution and the rise of Napoleon, Britain's greatest fear was that Ireland might ally with its continental enemy. In 1801, to eliminate this threat, the British government pushed through the Act of Union, merging England, Scotland, and Ireland into a single nation, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. On the surface, this was a move to strengthen unity, but in reality, it was designed mainly to tighten London's control over Ireland. The Irish, especially Catholics, did not enjoy equal rights. The Dublin Parliament was dissolved, and all power was centralized in Westminster. The result was a century of religious and political tension, sowing the seeds of future nationalist movements. Meanwhile, at the very heart of Britain, another revolution was quietly taking shape. The Industrial Revolution, which began in the late 18th century but exploded into full force during the 19th century. This was not a battle or a single decree, but a complete transformation of how people produced, operated, and lived. From James Watt steam engines to mechanized looms in the textile industry, to ironworks, and the emergence of the first railways and steamships, all of it propelled Britain into an unprecedented leap forward. Britain became the workshop of the world, where smokestacks billowed and steam engines roared without rest. Cities such as Manchester, Birmingham, and Liverpool swelled into new industrial hubs, while London emerged as the beating heart of global commerce and finance, a place where money, goods, and power flowed ceaselessly. But this prosperity did not bring only glory. It also transformed the social structure. A working class emerged. Former peasants who had left the countryside now crowded into factories and squalid slums, laboring to exhaustion under the dim light of oil lamps. The stark divide between wealth and poverty ignited new movements. A wave of political reforms followed. The Reform Acts of 1832, 1867, and 1884 gradually expanded voting rights, from aristocrats and landowners to include the middle and working classes. Trade unions were born, fighting for shorter working hours and better conditions. And in the heart of London, a German intellectual in exile named Karl Marx sat writing Das Kapital, a manifesto that critiqued industrial society and paved the way for future revolutionary movements. Thus, the Industrial Revolution did more than make Britain an economic superpower. It laid the foundation for modern society itself. From politics and science to class struggle, it was a storm of transformation that turned an island kingdom into the center of global power in the 19th century. As the 19th century progressed, following the upheavals of the Napoleonic Wars and the losses in the Americas, Britain rose again, stronger than ever before. From a small island nation, it had become the largest empire in human history. British territory spanned all continents, from icy Canada to fertile India, from far-flung Australia and New Zealand to the Caribbean, Africa, the Middle East, and even Hong Kong. A new Asian gateway seized after the Opium Wars. It was said that on this empire, the sun never sets, because somewhere at any moment, a corner of British land stood under daylight. To maintain such power, the Royal Navy became the undisputed ruler of the seas, ensuring that global trade passed through London's hands. Britain controlled not just the oceans, but also imposed a new world order, Pax Britannica, a kind of peace under imperial dominance, where no power dared challenge Britain's supremacy. For nearly a century, Britain played the role of global policeman, both defending its interests and shaping the rules of international affairs. The height of the British Empire was inextricably linked to the name Victoria. Ascending the throne in 1837 at the age of just 18, she reigned for 63 years, the longest reign in British history at the time. And the era came to be known as the Victorian Age. It was a period in which industry, science, and culture exploded with unprecedented power. From Michael Faraday's monumental discoveries in electricity and magnetism, to Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, and Florence Nightingale's reform of modern healthcare and nursing after the Crimean War, all helped reshape the face of humanity. In literature and the arts, Britain entered a new golden age. The novels of Charles Dickens laid bare the brutal truths of industrial society. The works of the Bronte sisters captured deep yearnings and personal tragedies, while the poetry of Alfred, Lord Tennyson reflected both the pride and melancholy of a people bearing the weight of the largest empire in the world. The empire continued to expand during Victoria's reign. After the Opium War, Hong Kong fell into British hands in 1842. India, the jewel in the crown, became a formal colony following the Sepoy Rebellion of 1857, when power was transferred from the East India Company to the Crown. In Africa, fierce competition with European powers brought Britain to Egypt, occupied in 1882 to control the Suez Canal, the lifeline of global trade. But beneath this magnificent surface, cracks began to show. At home, the gap between rich and poor became increasingly visible. The aristocracy and industrial bourgeoisie thrived, while the working class was crammed into dark, overcrowded slums. Trade unions, social reforms, and socialist ideologies began to emerge, challenging the old order. Abroad, nationalist sentiments were rising. Ireland continued to revolt for autonomy. while India saw the birth of its first political organizations, sowing the seeds of future independence. Toward the end of Victoria's reign, new challenges arose. The Boer War, 1899 to 1902, in South Africa, revealed that the empire was no longer invincible. British forces struggled in a long and costly war, fighting against resilient and mobile Boer farmers. It was a warning that this great empire was not built on victory alone, but must now contend with resistance and sacrifice. When Queen Victoria died in 1901, the entire empire mourned. She had reigned for 63 years, so long that many people had never known another monarch, besides her commanding shadow. Her death marked not only the end of her reign, but also the close of a golden age, an era when Britain was the center of global industry, science, and culture, when the Union Jack flew across every continent. The crown passed to her son, Edward VII, 1901 to 1910. Though his reign was brief, it brought a different atmosphere, more liberal, sociable, and connected to continental Europe. This period is often called the Edwardian era, a short but vibrant chapter when fashion, art, architecture, and the extravagant lifestyles of the elite flourished, even as the working class and women's movements continued to fight for their rights beneath the surface. After Edward came George V, 1910 to 1936, and it was under his rule that Britain faced its greatest challenge yet, World War I. The vast empire once celebrated under Queen Victoria had now become a burden, as millions of soldiers from India, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa were drawn into the fires of a global inferno. In 1914, when the first shots rang out in Sarajevo and Europe plunged into total war, the United Kingdom was immediately swept into the whirlwind of history, with the most powerful navy in the world and an empire spanning all continents. Britain joined the Allied powers against Germany, Austria, Hungary, and their allies, stepping into what contemporaries called the war to end all wars. The empire was not made up of Britons alone. From India, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa, millions of soldiers were called to arms, bringing with them loyalty to the crown, but leaving behind families on the other side of the globe. On the battlefields of Europe, they fought side by side with soldiers from London, Manchester, and Glasgow, all swept into the storm of mud and fire. Names like the Somme or Ypres became symbols of unimaginable horror. In the Battle of the Somme in 1916, on the very first day, the British Army suffered over 57,000 casualties, the single bloodiest day in British military history. At Ypres, poison gas was used for the first time, turning the sky into a deadly mist. And at Gallipoli, an ambitious expedition to defeat the Ottoman Empire turned into a disaster, claiming tens of thousands of lives from Britain and the colonies. By 1918, when the guns finally fell silent, the true cost was clear. Nearly 900,000 British soldiers had died, and millions more were wounded or carried psychological scars for life. British society was shaken. An entire generation of young men had been wiped out, leaving villages empty and families broken. The people lost faith in the ruling class who had led the country into such a bloody war. But from the pain, change was born. The demand for labor during wartime had brought women into factories, hospitals, and offices, places once deemed the domain of men. By the war's end, no one could deny their contribution. In 1918, British women won the right to vote for the first time, ushering in a new era in society. As World War I ended and Britain's wounds were still raw, another fire flared up in Ireland. The Irish had long yearned to break free from London's rule, and war only fanned the flames. In 1916, while the world was drowning in the mud of the Somme and Verdun, a group of Irish nationalists rose up in Dublin. The rebellion, known as the Easter Rising, was brutally suppressed and its leaders executed. But rather than extinguish the movement, their blood became seeds, awakening the spirit of independence across the island. From 1919 to 1921, Ireland entered a brutal guerrilla war. The Irish Republican Army, IRA, launched ambushes, assassinations, and attacks on British police and military forces. In response, The London government deployed the infamous paramilitary force known as the Black and Tans, spreading terror across villages and cities. This was not a war of endless trenches like in France, but one of bloody streets and burned-out villages, where civilians were swept into a cycle of hatred. Eventually, both sides realized that total victory was impossible. In 1921, after months of tense negotiations, the Anglo-Irish Treaty was signed. Under the agreement, an Irish Free State was established, a self-governing nation within the Commonwealth, recognizing the British monarch as a symbolic head of state. For many Irish, this marked victory after centuries of subjugation. But the treaty also planted the seeds of division. It required Republican leaders to swear allegiance to the British king, something many viewed as betrayal of full independence. In 1922, Ireland was officially partitioned. 26 counties in the south became the Irish Free State, while 6 counties in the north, where Protestants formed the majority, remained part of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. From that point on, the map of Ireland was split in two, a political and religious wound. In the north, Catholics and Protestants lived together, but in mistrust and conflict that would last throughout the century. For Britain, the loss of most of Ireland was a shock, a contraction of empire in its very own backyard. For Ireland, it was both the day of independence and the beginning of new tragedies: civil war, division, and the Northern Ireland conflict, which would last until the end of the 20th century. At the same time in Britain, the post-war economy was in decline, with unemployment spreading and the working class growing increasingly militant. The climax came in the general strike of 1926, when over 2 million workers from various sectors stopped working to protest low wages and harsh conditions. It became one of the most significant social crises in modern British history. The 1930s brought a new challenge: the Great Depression. Factories shut down, trade collapsed, and even Britain as a financial center staggered. People lost faith in the ruling elite's ability to manage the crisis, and extreme political movements from both the left and right began to rise, reflecting deep dissatisfaction. During the same period, the world was shaken by the rise of dictatorial regimes in Germany and Italy. In London, politicians initially hoped to maintain peace through appeasement, a policy later criticized. But as Hitler expanded further, from occupying the Rhineland, annexing Austria, to demanding Sudetenland, the voices of warning grew louder. On September 1st, 1939, when Nazi Germany crossed the Polish border, Europe once again descended into flames. 2 days later, the United Kingdom declared war on Germany, officially entering World War II. Unlike in 1914, this time the public understood the danger. Adolf Hitler was not merely a dictator, but a man bent on redrawing the map of the world in blood. At first, Britain faced a leadership crisis. But in 1940, as Europe collapsed one by one before Germany's lightning advance, from Norway, Denmark, the Netherlands, Belgium, to even France, a figure emerged and changed everything: Winston Churchill. Becoming Prime Minister of the darkest hour, Churchill promised no glory, only blood, toil, tears, and sweat. With his gravelly voice and unyielding resolve, he became the defiant symbol of a nation that refused to bow. In the summer of 1940, Hitler planned an invasion of Britain, Operation Cilium. Before that, Germany launched a massive bombing campaign, turning British skies into a battlefield. Night after night, air raid sirens screamed, and bombs rained down on London, Coventry, Liverpool. These attacks became known as the Blitz. Tens of thousands of civilians perished. But the British did not fall. In air raid shelters, they sang and joked, while above, the Royal Air Force, RAF, fought fiercely. In the Battle of Britain, 1940, young RAF pilots drove back the Luftwaffe, forcing Hitler, for the first time, to abandon a direct invasion. It was a turning point, the first time in the war that Germany had been stopped. In the years that followed, Britain stood its ground. They fought at sea, keeping vital shipping lanes open. They fought in North Africa, where General Montgomery defeated Rommel at El Alamein, and they engaged in brutal campaigns across the Mediterranean. At the same time, Britain served as a massive aircraft carrier, preparing for the day the Allies would strike back. On June 6, 1944, D-Day, that moment came. Hundreds of thousands of Allied troops stormed the beaches of Normandy, with British and Canadian forces taking lead roles on the eastern flank. After nearly 5 years of steadfast resistance, Britain finally joined the largest offensive in history, paving the way for the liberation of Western Europe from Nazi control. In 1945, the war ended. Hitler committed suicide in his Berlin bunker. Europe was freed. Britain could hold its head high, one of the few nations that stood firm from the first day to the final victory. But victory brought no prosperity. Britain emerged from war economically shattered, cities in ruins from the bombing, and crippling debts piling up. The empire, once hailed as a land where the sun never sets, now began to falter. The war had made it clear. True power now resided with two rising giants, the United States and the Soviet Union. For Britain, 1945 marked the beginning of a new era, the decline of empire and the long, difficult road of decolonization ahead. In 1947, the most significant turning point arrived. India, the jewel in the crown, gained independence, but the partition into India and Pakistan triggered chaotic migrations and bloody violence between Hindus and Muslims. Though it left deep wounds, this marked the beginning of a wave of decolonization that swept across Asia and Africa. In the following 2 decades, from Burma, Sri Lanka, and Malaysia to Nigeria, Kenya, Ghana, and many other African nations, the Union Jack was lowered one by one. In the Caribbean, small island nations also gradually severed direct rule from London. The British Empire, once hailed as a realm where the sun never sets, had officially come to an end. In its place arose a new form, the Commonwealth of Nations, a voluntary association where former colonies maintained cultural, economic, and political ties with Britain. Though it no longer ruled them, London's influence remained profound, through language, legal systems, institutions, and the enduring presence of the British royal family, the kind of soft power that still resonates to this day. But even as the empire dissolved overseas, a wound within the Union itself began to bleed. Northern Ireland, the region that had remained part of the UK since 1922, became the epicenter of a decades-long conflict. The tension stemmed from religious and political divisions. The Protestant majority sought to remain in the United Kingdom, while the Catholic minority aspired to unite with the Republic of Ireland. By the late 1960s, the situation exploded into violence. Peaceful civil rights marches by Catholics were met with repression, sparking fierce retaliation by the Irish Republican Army, IRA. Bombings, assassinations, and ambushes spread. Loyalist paramilitary struck back, and the British Army was drawn into the conflict. This period became known as the Troubles, one of the darkest chapters in modern British history. One of the most haunting moments came on Bloody Sunday, January 30th, 1972, when British soldiers opened fire on a peaceful protest in Derry, killing 14 civilians. The event poured fuel on a fire of hatred, plunging Northern Ireland deeper into decades of unrest. More than 3,500 people were killed, tens of thousands wounded, and cities like Belfast and Derry endured years of bombings, tension, and mutual suspicion. Only near the end of the century did hope for peace begin to emerge. In 1998, after lengthy negotiations, the Good Friday Agreement was signed. It established a power-sharing government between the two communities and created mechanisms for cooperation between Northern Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, and London. Though it did not erase all grievances, the agreement brought an end to most of the violence, giving Northern Ireland a chance to rebuild and begin the long process of healing. After the end of World War II and the collapse of the Empire, the United Kingdom seemed to have entered a period of stability. But the 21st century began with challenges no less brutal than traditional battlefields. On September 11, 2001, when planes crashed into New York and Washington, the world was shaken, and Britain immediately became the closest ally to the United States in what was called the War on Terror. In Afghanistan, British troops were deployed to Helmand, one of the most dangerous battlefields. For nearly 20 years, tens of thousands of British soldiers endured the dusty deserts and mine-laden villages, facing the Taliban in prolonged combat. Hundreds never returned, and the war left behind a generation of veterans bearing both physical and psychological wounds. The fight didn't end there. In 2003, Prime Minister Tony Blair led Britain into war in Iraq alongside the U.S. With the goal of overthrowing Saddam Hussein. The justification, weapons of mass destruction, was later revealed to be unfounded, turning the decision into a deeply painful political wound. The war claimed the lives of hundreds of British troops and sparked widespread protests at home, forever linking Blair's name to a controversial conflict. But the battlefield was not just far away. In London, in 2005, citizens suffered a horrifying shock during the morning rush hour on July 7th, for suicide bombers attacked the underground and bus, killing 52 and injuring more than 700. The attack, known as the 7/7 bombings, became one of the darkest memories in modern British history. Images of exploded train carriages, thick dust in the tunnels, and panicked civilians fleeing in terror deeply etched the fear of terrorism into the heart of a city once confident in its invincibility. From Afghanistan to Iraq, from Helmand to the streets of London, Britain in the early 21st century faced a bitter truth. The enemy no longer came only from beyond its borders, but could emerge from within its own immigrant communities. And the war on terror, instead of being a short-term campaign, became a long shadow stretching across decades, both on global battlefields and in the daily lives of citizens. After centuries of centralized rule from Westminster, the late 20th century marked a historic turning point: devolution, the process of devolving power. This was not merely administrative reform, but a fundamental question. Could the United Kingdom still hold together as one nation? In Scotland, after centuries of resentment toward imposition from London, a separate parliament was established in Edinburgh in 1999. The new building became a symbol of local authority. Scots were granted autonomy in vital areas such as education, healthcare, justice, and domestic transport. Though still part of the Union, for the first time since 1707, Scotland experienced a sense of self-governance on its own soil. Wales, a land conquered since the time of Edward I, was also granted greater powers. The Senedd, the Welsh Parliament, was established, initially with only advisory roles but gradually expanding into a legislative body with increasing authority. From a territory once seen as merely an appendage of England, Wales began asserting a distinct political identity. As for Northern Ireland, once mired in the violent vortex of the Troubles, a special framework was created after the Good Friday Agreement in 1998, a power-sharing government, requiring representatives of both the Catholic and Protestant communities to sit together at the same table. It was a fragile but essential model, designed to maintain peace after decades of bloodshed. The process of devolution has eased many tensions, granting people greater powers of self-determination. But it also raises a painful question. If Scotland has its own parliament, Wales a national assembly, and Northern Ireland a devolved government, then is the United Kingdom still a single nation or merely a fragile alliance? That question exploded in 2014 when Scotland held a referendum on independence. For the first time in modern history, the Scottish people had the power to choose: remain in the Union or break away to become an independent nation. During those tense weeks, the entire United Kingdom followed every debate, every rally, every ballot. When the results were announced, 55% voted to stay, 45% to leave, a narrow victory for the Unionist side. Westminster breathed a sigh of relief, but the celebrations were short-lived, because despite the defeat, the Scottish independence movement did not vanish. It continued to simmer within Scotland's political sphere, and even grew stronger after Brexit, as many Scots felt they were dragged out of Europe against their will. The question of unity, therefore, still hangs over the United Kingdom like a gray cloud, ensuring that the 21st century is no less uncertain at home than it is abroad. In the early decades of the 21st century, the United Kingdom is no longer the empire where the sun never sets, but it remains a global power. As a member of the G7, a permanent seat on the UN Security Council, and a key pillar of NATO, Britain still has a voice in all major international arenas. The Royal Navy, once the backbone of the empire, remains one of the most modern and agile forces in the world, capable of intervening in crises from the Middle East to Pacific. However, after Brexit, the country entered a period of profound challenge. The decision to leave the European Union, one of the biggest turning points since World War II, left deep scars across society. Cities versus countryside, youth versus the older generation, Scotland and Northern Ireland at odds with the national outcome. A alongside trade barriers and diminished influence in Europe. The UK also faces a host of internal crises: sluggish growth, rising inflation, a cost of living crisis, and the heavy legacy of the COVID-19 pandemic, which shook the economy and left lasting consequences on public health and society. Even so, Britain's soft power continues to shine. British culture remains a global phenomenon. From the timeless melodies of the Beatles, the worldwide success of Harry Potter, to the irresistible appeal of the Premier League, a football competition followed by billions each week. Music, fashion, cinema, academia, and language all serve as global emissaries of British influence, far beyond the nation's geographical size. But the future is not without shadows. The internal threat of separatism still looms. Scotland, with the 2014 referendum and post-Brexit discontent, continues to ask whether it should remain in the Union. Northern Ireland, though enjoying peace under the Good Friday Agreement, is still shaken by political disputes and post-Brexit border tensions, with underlying risks of division. Thus, the story of the United Kingdom in the 21st century is not just about reclaiming global status after leaving the EU, but about struggling to preserve unity at home. A nation that once built the largest empire in history must now face a paradox: how to maintain the cohesion of the very lands united centuries ago. The future of Britain, therefore, remains unwritten, a chapter in progress, where a glorious past and a challenging present coexist, and where the world continues to watch every step of the island that once ruled the seas.